Okay, so to get these things rendered real quick, the first thing I'm going to do is I have to decide, if I want to have the same leaf texture on the leaves or if I want to randomize them. So we can see these have about 24,000 leaves on them, or 24,000 polys. This one's 21. I have been showing you this script, which allows me to split up the UVs, but I've just in the process of making the DVD have actually found a much faster one because I got tired of waiting. And so it's something that, I talk about also later on when I get into grass and trees and stuff, but, didn't record all this stuff completely in order, and I think it's important for me to bring it up now. And if you go to the DJX blog, you'll find this script where basically he was aware of this other script and just chose to write one in Python that calculates way faster. And so just go to, and let me just bring the website up real quick. Here it is. So go to djx.com.au. It's not djxblog.com. So djx.com.au. You'll find the Maya PaintFX Leaf UV layout script. It's great because it's super fast. So it allows you to split things into, you can see here's a 4x4, 2x2, 3x3. So it's free. You can download it, install it. And once you've installed it, I'm not going to show you how to install it because that's really easy. Just follow the instructions. But once you've installed it, what you can do is just in Maya, I'll go to the Python tab in the script editor, and then you just have this text. And so you can see I have it saved to a shelf, so I can just hit it as a button. And it just imports the script, and then inside here you specify whether you want a 2x2 or a 3x3. So if I choose to, let's say, do a 2x2 on this guy, and I put that to 2, then I can just select my leaves and then hit execute. And so what's awesome is you don't have to separate and combine it. And so that's a nice step to save, because that can take a while if you have something that's a lot of polygons. So you don't have to separate and combine it. You just select the leaves and hit enter. And you can see how fast that calculated. And so I can now, in here, we'll see if I grab the leaves for that bush and go to the UV texture editor, we can see that they're all in 0 to 1 using the default PaintFX leaf for the bush. Well, if I grab the leaves here, you can see that it's 2x2. You can see there's a UV there, 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 and there. So it's awesome. So again, sorry for all the time you spent watching me use the other script, because now I use the script. And so for this one, I'll also put it to 2. So 2x2. So again, I've got the leaves selected and enter. Calculates super fast. And then if I go in here, we can see UV texture editor 2x2. So with that done, if I want to render this real quick, I'm going to go into render settings. I'm going to switch to mental ray. I'm going to up my quality to 1. Right off the bat, I'm going to set refractions to 10 and trace depth 20. I'm going to switch to Gauss 2 and 2. So that's what I've been using lately. For stills, I'll generally use Mitchell. If I'm going to be rendering animation, Gauss 2 and 2 gives me something sharp that looks good, but less prone to artifacting than Mitchell is for animation. 1 is not obviously for final, but for a test render is fine. And then under indirect lighting, I'm going to create physical sun and sky. And then final gather is on. The default settings for final gather, while okay for final renders, is actually sometimes even high for final renders. So I'm going to use inside here 50.1 and 30. And so your render time killer is really the point density. And so for test renders, 0.1 is fine. And for a lot of final animations, I find that I don't really have to go higher than 0.5. This does really have a big effect on render time. What has less of an effect on render time is adding a secondary diffuse bounce, which helps makes things look a little bit more believable as far as your final gather and bounce light. I usually set the filter to 1. Sometimes it's not an issue and you can leave it at 0, but sometimes you get little speckles in the animation and that removes them. And then since we have a secondary bounce, I'll increase the tracing to 2, 2, and 4. So putting the secondary bounce to 1 and this to 1 and this to 2, 2, and 4 makes it take a little bit longer to render, but the fact that I lowered the point density from 1 to 0.1 really, really speeds up the render. So I'm going for, overall look as opposed to the point density. So, and the end, you're going to have to do test renders to see what you're happy with. But most of the renders that I do, my point density for test renders is a 0.1, and for final renders is around 0.25 to 0.5. If you have a lot of tiny, tiny detail in the scene, which you could say is true if you have leaves, then you would want a higher point density to really capture the final gather more accurately. But using ambient occlusion on your MIA shaders helps to bring some of that detail back, so it's a compromise. So those are just my initial settings. And then the next thing that I pretty much always do is I'm going to select my camera, go to Hypergraph Connections, graph it, and it's using the MIA exposure simple. I always like to switch to the exposure photographic. So in Hypershade, I'm going to go under Mental Ray, under Lenses, create the photographic exposure node. I'm going to plug that into my MIA physical sky and my camera. So I'm going to delete the connections for the exposure simple and connect the exposure photographic. And for the camera connection, it's default. While for the sky connection, go to Other, connect Message to MI Sky Exposure, and make sure Show Hidden is on both sides. And then I can delete the exposure simple. Then, since we switched to exposure photographic, which I think is easier to use to get more photorealistic results, on the physical sky node, you will need to adjust the RGB unit conversion to 0.318, 0.318, 0.318. And then as a start point on the exposure node, the f-stop, I'm going to lower it. Otherwise, the image is going to be a little dark. So for midday lighting, generally around 0.9 for the f-stop works. If the sun's low in the sky, meaning like evening or morning, you might need to lower the f-stop. And obviously, you're going to need to do test renders to adjust. But generally, setting that to 9 is what I do for general daytime as a start point. And then finally, very often before using these exposure nodes, when I did renders, I'd often, adjust levels in post, to crush the blacks a little bit, make the highlights a little brighter. So what's awesome is you can do that on this node. And so generally, I just go and throw these to high numbers. So I like to look at these as adjusting levels, in post, where I'm taking the black point up a little bit and making the highlights a little brighter, and it tends to make your image look a little bit more realistic, has a little bit more contrast, like you would see in a normal photograph. So those are just some initial quick changes that I make. I've got my sun in here. I'm going to create a ground plane. And I'm going to turn on my resolution gate so I can see what's going to render. I'm going to set to HD 720. All right, I'm going to save my scene again. And now I need to go to Hypershade and get rid of the fugly shaders that come with Paint Effects, or that it creates. So I'm going to need 3 MIA materials. So this one is for the ground. This one is going to be my branches. And this one is going to be my leaves. So I'm going to grab the ground and assign that. I'm going to grab the branches and assign that. And I'm going to grab the leaves and assign that. So I can now delete unused, and it'll get rid of the Paint Effects ones. On my ground, I'm just going to make it really, really dark with really blurry reflections. And under the BRDF, I don't want it to be so reflective, so I'm going to lower the reflectivity on the ground quite a bit and turn on ambient occlusion. Then on my branches, as a generic start point, I want them to be brown. So as opposed to worrying about textures right now, because we don't even really see the branches that much, they're so small, I can just put a brown color here, but the problem is since we're using the exposure node, we need to gamma correct our textures. And so I'm going to go to Texture, the color, and under Utilities, I'm going to grab a gamma correct node. We have to set the gamma to 0.454 to gamma correct our colors, and then I can choose a brown color here. So here I can just go and grab, let's say, some kind of brownish color for the leaves, or rather for the branches. Okay, so this is my branches, and then branches, being wood, are going to have a little bit of roughness. They're not going to have in-focus reflections. The reflections are going to be kind of blurry. And under BRDF, I tend to use something around this for branches. So it's not very reflective facing the camera, and as it turns away, it's a little more reflective, but the reflection value is still relatively low. So, and then this I can use as a global dial for how bright that is. So that's just a start point for the branches. And then for the leaves, obviously this gets a little bit more involved. So for the leaves, I know that I'm probably going to want to use a texture. And so let's go and first map the diffuse. So I'm going to have to texture it with a gamma correct node, 0.454, and then put a file texture into that. And I always put the filter to 0.1. And then I can go and grab a leaf texture. So let me go and find a leaf texture that we can use. So as far as a, I have a bunch of different leaf textures, but as far as something that's a, 2 by 2, I've got that, which I guess we can use, which we've used before. And that's probably fine for this. So I can go and grab that. And so now we've got this going inside here. But I need to use the alpha to the cutout opacity. So if you remember, we're just going to go and grab a reverse utility, luminance utility. So that we want to connect the out transparency to the input, and then that's default, so, or rather value. And then we connect that to cutout opacity. So the out value of the luminance goes to cutout opacity. So now our alpha channel is set up. So it's using the alpha channel from that texture for the cutout opacity. And then we also know that we're going to want to have some translucency on these leaves. And so for that, I'm going to put the reflectivity to 1, glossiness on these leaves at 0.3. These leaves have no thickness, so I need to turn off skip reflection on inside. And under refraction, we'll start at around 0.25 for translucency. And again, these are thin-walled, they're not solid because they have no thickness. Under BRDF, I'm going to say 0.1 and 1 as a start point. I'm going to also turn on translucency with a weight of 1, turn on ambient occlusion. And then I also now need to map the translucency. So I can use the same texture if I want to, just as a start point, although generally I kind of know that I'm going to need to do it this way. Grab a multiply divide node that I'll set to 444 because we set 0.25 for the transparency value. And then under the input 1, I can go and grab a gamma correct node set to 0.454 and then texture that with a file texture. 0.1, and I can go and grab that same texture if I want to. So now if I graph, it looks like this, right? And so as far as having the same texture in there, generally you're going to want to have a texture that you spend a little bit more time customizing, which we'll look at. But for now, I'm just going to take the one I'm using for translucency, and I'll just make it a little bit brighter. So it's a little bit, let's say, more yellow. So we can see it's just a brighter version of that one, just a little bit. Okay. So reflectivity at 1, glossiness at 0.3, skip reflection on inside is off. Transparency is at 0.25, and that's why I set that to 4, because 0.25 times 4 is 1, and that's what you need to do. Thin-walled, BRDF is 0.1 and 1, translucency is on, weight is 1, which means it's translucent, not transparent. And that's my start point. So that's assigned to the leaves. Okay. And so now inside here, if we just want to go in and check things, we can see if I grab the branches, it's got the branches. If I grab the leaves, let's grab the leaves. Just making sure things are assigned. If I grab the ground, it's got this one. And save. And let's do a render and see what that looks like. So I'm going to grab the render view, and I'm going to render it out. And so it's going to render the final gather relatively quick because I lowered the point density down to 0.1. So now I can see I've got my 4 different leaf textures inside here. And almost done. All right, so I'm not too crazy about the yellow leaves that are inside there. And so what I'm going to do now is just make a couple changes. So let's say instead of using that texture, because I don't really like that texture so much, let's use something a little bit better. So I'm going to go into Hypershade, graph the leaves, and then inside here, I'm going to go and let's say I grab something where I have a, let's say I'm going to go to my maps, leaf scans, and I've got this leaf I can use, so I can see that I've got a front and a back for that one. You can see I have lots of different directories inside here. I also have, this, which is a pretty good start point as a leaf, and so this is just a front and back, where I've then also made bump and so forth. It's going to end up looking better if you obviously map the bump and map the spec. So the bump and spec are just grayscale versions, while in here we can see that I also have the transparency map for it. So if I use this one and I say, okay, well, birch front color, and I map that, that's just a single leaf. And so since that's just a single leaf, but my UVs are now set to 4,4, that's okay, because what I can do is go to the placement node and repeat it 2 and 2. And now you can see I'm getting that. So now it's a 4,4. And the nice thing is I could again multiply this file texture by like noise or a fractal or a stucco to create some variety in the color there. So this is my front color. And then I'm going to go in here, and then you can see I have my front SSS, so that's going to be that guy, 2 and 2. And we can use this instead. So I obviously do also have different textures for the back and the spec and all that. So let's go in here and let's map the reflection color with the file texture, which is going to be the front spec. And then on that one, I'm also going to want to set the filter to 0.1. And then I'm going to want to also map the bump. So standard bump, file texture, bump depth real small, let's say 0.05. File texture, filter 0.1 so it doesn't blur it out. And let's grab the front bump. And then finally, under the refraction, where we set the transparency, I'll map the color there with my transparency map, which just has the veins in it, which I also have to put to 0.1. So once you start to build your library of textures, building your shaders go really fast because you have all this stuff sitting around. Now you can see I have the issue of this has to be 4x4. What I also like to do is just delete the placement nodes on all these guys. and just use one. So I'll just default. So they all get set to repeat 2 by 2. So I only have to change that in one spot. All right. And so now, with that set, I could also choose to have a different color for the front than I have for the back. And so for that, I can do the double-sided material. A fast way to do that is I'm going to go to Mental Ray, Sample Compositing, MIB two-sided. But instead of having two MIA materials going into a surface shader, I can also just do this. I can say, well, this is my front color. And so what I need to do is look at my leaves and see, okay, well, we can see for the ones that are facing the sky, where's the normal on them? And I can see I get a lot of intersecting leaves, but that's okay. And so if I select these and go to polygons and turn on the face normals, we can see that the normals are pointing down on these leaves. And so since the front is considered where the normal is pointing out, what we can do is select the leaves, and under polygons, reverse the normals. So the normals are oriented the way we want. And then all these, turn on the face normals. For this bush, we can see they're pointing down again, and reverse the normals. And then hide the normals. Okay. And then back to my shader and hypershade. I had that MIB two-sided node, which now has disappeared, which is going to be inside here, MIB two-sided. All right. So this we know is our front color. So I can connect that to front, disconnect that, and then just connect the MIB node, the MIB two-sided, to diffuse. So I've been doing it more that way now than creating the two shaders going into surface shader, just because it's faster. And then I can go and create another file texture. That's going into a gamma utility. So 0.454. And this file texture is the back color. And then this goes into back. And so now if I graph inside here, we can see that the MIB two-sided has this texture as the back color for the leaves, and this texture as the front color for the leaves. And then again, use the same place 2D node. So yeah, and I can do this with the translucency, I can do this with speck and bump and all of that stuff, but for now, we've done enough. So let's go in here and do another render. And I'll let that render. All right, so that's feeling a little bit better. And so I think at this point my scene is getting a little bit overexposed. And so I think I'm just going to go in here and, maybe we'll try rendering from the front and lower the angle of the sun a little bit, which is going to make the scene a little bit darker. Or I could adjust the exposure. But hopefully you've seen that, once you've done this a bunch of times, setting up, the shader can go relatively quick. And so now we can see we've got these bushes in here. And those are working okay. I think that, based on this sun angle, I would want to get a texture in there for the branches. So I'm going to go to my branches and map that with a file texture. I'll just grab some generic bark texture. And so let's see what would work for those branches. Really, anything in here would probably work just fine. I'll just grab that. And this is going to need to be repeated. I'll just set it to 4 for now. And render just that region there. So at least now it's not a solid color. So it's a little bit of a bright wood, but I can always make that darker later. Okay, so if I look at this and I decide, all right, well, that's cool, but I can now decide I want to do something that looks a little bit more interesting. So maybe I'll get, maybe first I want actually to have, after looking at it rendered, maybe it's not thick enough, or rather there's not enough leaves. So these obviously already have history removed on them. So what I would need to do is delete these. And then with those deleted, also I can see in here, which is funky, those are still in there. That's what was acting weird. Knew something was acting weird. These weren't hidden, the paint effects, the originating paint effect strokes, display, hide, selection. And so now we have just our mesh geometry inside here. So I knew I was seeing some colors in there that I shouldn't. But regardless, delete those, make the original paint effect strokes visible. And then if I'm still making changes, I can choose to take these guys and leave construction history on by hitting that little button there, and then converting them to polygons. So now the advantage is that I have construction history, and then also make sure those are hidden. So now I can go and assign my shaders. So I'll assign my branches, and I'll assign my leaves. So these are set to 4 by 4 or 2 by 2, but now I'll just set it to 1 by 1, so I don't need to worry about applying that script. Okay, and now what I can do is go to my brush preset, since I have construction history on, and I'm going to go to Tubes, Creation, Growth, Twigs, and I'm going to increase the number of twig clusters. And you can see this one now updated, but it updated on the poly object, which has the shaders assigned and is ready to render. So I'm going to go to the render view window and render. So going and making adjustments is very, very easy. And if I did want to apply that UV layout script to the leaves, I could still do that. And so now we can see this bush on the left has twice the density or thickness as the bush on the right. And I think that that looks a little bit better as a bush. So I'll just undo that, or rather kill the render. And I'll do the same thing on my other bush. And so on this bush, I set it to 100. So I'll set that one to 100 also. And there we go. So now I could choose to obviously use a little bit of branch dropout and twig dropout to randomize things a little bit so they're not looking so spherical. Let's take a look at this from a couple different perspectives. Maybe we'll backlight this a little bit. And then the next thing I'd want to point out with bushes is that we've created a bush now that just has a single trunk. And so it's also common that you might want to create a bush where you have more than one trunk. And so that would mean increasing the number of start tubes. So instead of having just a single start tube inside there, we have more than one. But you can see this looks like two decent little bushes. So I could probably increase the reflectivity where it's facing the camera on the shader, which means going to the leaf MIA material, and under the BRDF it's set to 0.1 where it's facing the camera. I could set that to 0.2 if I wanted to. But as far as what I was talking about a second ago, if I wanted to make that change, I would choose to, let's say we do it to the bush on the right. I'm going to take that bush. I'm going to lower the number of twig clusters down just so that the performance is faster. So now we have this bush. And again, we can see it just has a single trunk inside there. So if I want to modify that, I can go up here under creation, under tubes, and you'll see we have tubes per step and start tubes. So if I increase the tubes per step, you can see now there are two trunks inside there. And if you want to adjust the spacing on them, you can see that under brush profile you have brush width. And we can use that to get them to not be so close together. So now I can have a bush that has two trunks instead of one. So if I choose to do that a little bit, maybe spread them out a little, I now have a different looking kind of bush. And so some bushes actually would have a lot of start tubes inside them. So I can go in here and increase that. Just be careful, because if you increase it too dramatically, your polygon count will shoot up like crazy. And I'm just going to randomize that a little bit. So now we have a few start tubes in that guy. If you want to see exactly what's going on, we can just turn the leaves off for a second. So you can see we now have 5 start tubes. So maybe I'll now go up here and lower the brush width a little bit. On that bush. And I could choose to randomize them a little bit. And maybe adjust the width a little bit at the base. And then maybe get the leaves back on. And then for this guy, you can see the twig clusters are only at 20, but that's still looking very, very full because of the fact that there's more base trunks inside there. And so we could now do another render to see how that bush has changed. I'll give that a second. All right, so save my scene. So this bush on the right, I think, looks a little bit, cooler, just because it's not, getting this sort of very spherical look to it by increasing, the number of start trunks inside there, offsetting them a little bit. You can see that we're just getting a little bit more, of an edge inside here where we can see some of the individual branches with some of the leaves on them. And I think it looks a little bit better. So if I decide, well, that's what I want my bush to look like over here, then I can always copy the settings from one stroke to another, which is easy enough to do. So, because remember that you can always select a brush and under rendering paint effects, get settings from selected stroke, and then I can go to this guy and then say paint effects, apply settings to selected stroke. And so now this guy will change. Although let's look at him. And we can see on this guy, let's hide the leaves so it's easier for me to see that this guy now does have more start trunks, but I'm going to increase the brush width on them a little bit. And I'm going to go and adjust twig dropout a little bit. Okay. And then I can also play with the seed value. So I think that one's cool, just because, again, it broke up the silhouette a little bit. So these are both basically the same stroke, just with some changes. And then we can take a look at that. Where's my sun? My sun is there. Let's render that guy out. It's rendering. I can already see that I kind of want to increase the density on it, so I'm just going to stop that render and grab that brush. And so I want to increase the number of twig clusters on this guy. Yeah, I'll use that. So it's a back and forth, but hopefully the time we've spent making these bushes has taught you a little bit about making custom paint effects plants. So we'll make a couple more, but just because there's a couple different types of plants that you want to understand how you might want to play with the settings to accomplish. But I think that also you'll see that, the branch network inside here, having the segments, where the default segments, remember, was 7, way too low. Now at the segments we have, we're seeing some straight lines in here, but it's really not that bad. And I think that this is kind of feeling like a pretty decent little bush. Because again, lots of bushes do have lots of little trunks that are growing into them. So yeah, I think we've now created bushes that I would use. I think those look all right. So what else to talk about with bushes? Not much really. We've got these. If I want another one in here, just remember, duplicate special, input graph. Now I got another. So for that one, display, show selection, grab that guy, maybe scoot him over here. So now we got 3 of them. And for that guy, convert him to poly. But first I'm going to randomize the seed value on them, just so I get a different bush. Okay. And then once I'm happy with it, or whenever, paint effects to polygons. So you can see I have hide strokes off. I'm going to turn hide strokes on so that when I convert it, I've got the poly object, but it hid the stroke. And then of course I need to assign my shaders. So I've got my branches, I've got my leaves, and I can delete unused. So branches, leaves, ground. So I'm just going to zoom out a little bit because we're a little close. And I'll let that render. All right. So 3 bushes. So if we were to evaluate other things we could do, I think it really would just be changing the type of brush by adjusting the leaves, changing the type of texture so we have different shaped leaves, adjusting the amount of bend on the leaves if we wanted to. We can still see that there's a little bit of bend in them, but it's relatively subtle. So hopefully you now understand between leaf curl, leaf bend, and leaf stiffness, how you can adjust the shape of the leaves. While also knowing that obviously the overall shape of the leaf is just adjusted by your texture. And so if I were to select these leaves right now and go to the UV texture editor and specify that it should show my leaf. I can also see that my leaf in here, is this shape. And so basically a good chunk of the leaf is not being shown inside there. I could choose to adjust the UVs to be more form-fitting to that, but that would just, in the end, change the shape of the leaf. And, all right, so I'm going to pause for a second as I decide what next kind of plant we should make. But that's our bushes.